In this video, we're going to be looking at the Create Crevices command. We go down to where that is on this preset. We have this command. As you can see, there's a lot of information for this command. Because of that, I'm going to focus right now only on what's in these text boxes at the bottom. The rest of the parameters are described in the help text here. You're just changing the values of the parameters. So it's pretty straightforward, especially if you look at the help text to see what those parameters and values do. These text boxes, however, can be a lot more challenging and a lot harder to understand. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on. Now you have two different text boxes here that we're looking at. As you can see, this is the main crevices settings right here. And this is the side crevices settings down here. Now these work the same way, so I'll only be looking at the main crevice settings in this video. However, whatever you do here can also be done down here. The differences are your main crevice is the main path that the crevice follows, as you see on this image here, and the side crevices are the small branching crevices that come off of it. So normally you want to set the side crevices up smaller, and you want to have the main crevice be larger. Otherwise, they work exactly the same. So we're just going to look at this first text box. I'm going to scroll down here to the help text about it. I do recommend you look through this if you are going to edit these commands. The first part we look at here is this bird's eye view. What this is showing us is that every line that you have on here represents a certain set of blocks. The first line is just going to be a single row, 1 meter wide. And then every other line will add one layer to each side of the previous row. So red is your first line on the text box, blue is your second line, green is your third line. So every line other than the first one will add 2 meters to the width of your crevice. So if we look at this first example here for main crevice, you have 7 lines, which means you're going to have 15 meter wide crevice. And the side crevice settings has 2 lines, which means it's going to be 3 meters wide. 1 meter for the first line, and an additional 2 meters for the second line, for a total of 3. That part's the easy part. You're just adding more lines to make it wider, or fewer lines to make it thinner. The more challenging part is what you put on these lines. The main thing you want to look at is depth. There are 3 different commands that affect that depth depending how you want to set the depth and how you want to control how the crevice is created. These are height factors, height mods, and height sets. They all work differently, and you would only choose one of those parameters for each line. You can have different parameters on different lines. As you can see, the first line's height sets, then height factors, then height mods, and then height factors again. But each line should have only one of those. Height factors is basically a percentage of depth to bedrock. So for example, on here we have 0.3 and 0.4, which means the crevice will be between 30% to 40% of the depth to bedrock. The way this works is at a higher elevation for the terrain surrounding the crevice will then be deeper than if the crevice started at a lower elevation. In either case, the percentage to bedrock is how deep it will be. So if your height is at 100 at the top of the crevice and you set the height factors to 0.3 to 0.4, it will drop down to between 30 and 40 meters above bedrock. And if your height where you started at was 50, then it would be between 15 and 20 meters above bedrock. This is probably the easiest one to understand, but it does mean that your crevices will have different depths based on the elevation, which may or may not be what you're looking for. Our second option here is height mods. Height mods will give you a specific depth from the top of the crevice. So if you have a height mod set to -10 to -20, it means that your depth's going to be between 10 meters and 20 meters from the top of the crevice. This lets you make sure that your crevices don't go too deep if you want to keep them shallower, and it lets you set that range that you want to use for those. Note that if you use a positive number instead of negative, it will raise the crevice above the ground instead of into the ground. If you've watched the features preview tutorial, you will see the inverted crevice, and that's how that is made. It's using positive values instead of negative values. Now, if you look at this default preset, it's got height mods and it's 0.4, 0.6, then again 0.1, 0.4. Those are positive, but what that is that's at the edge of the crevice, and it's designed to give a little bit of a raised lip at the edge of the crevice. So it looks as if the crevice is cracked and it pushed up the ground a little bit around the edges of the crevice. But if you want to use height mods to set a depth, then you want to use negative numbers to set that range. And then the elevations will be some random number between that range that you choose. The third option, height sets, is similar to height mods in that it sets a specific depth. However, instead of being a depth from the surface, it is a total distance from bedrock. So if you have 30 and 40, it means that the crevice will go as deep as 30 to 40 meters above bedrock. It will never be lower or higher than that. This can keep you from having the depth too close to bedrock if you don't want it to be too close. But like height factors, this means that if your elevation is higher, you're going to have a deeper crevice. And if your elevation is lower, your crevice won't be as deep. So the first and third options don't control how deep your crevice will be. That will be determined by the elevation of the terrain around the crevice. The second option lets you set the depth based on the elevation that you're at, rather than having a set elevation. You can choose whichever one works best for you. Sometimes one will work better for a specific row. Sometimes you want to mix and match, or you may want to use the same one on all rows. Next, we're going to look at the min and max height values. These values allow you to set a minimum or maximum depths for the crevice, regardless of the parameters that you set above. In most cases, max height doesn't really matter too much. However, min height can be more important. Bedrock is normally 3 meters deep, and if you don't want to compromise that bedrock, you can set minimum height to 3 or higher, and the crevice will never be deeper than that. Both minimum and maximum heights will override these height parameters that you set here, so you will always be within this range no matter what you set for these parameters. It's a way to help limit these so that no matter what, your crevice doesn't end up with invalid numbers. For example, if height mods is set to this -10 to -20, and your terrain elevation is only 10, you're not going to want the crevice to go to a -20 elevation. By using this minimum height, it prevents that from happening. The next option is height change rate. This determines how often that the height elevation can change along a single row. So when you set one of these height commands to a range, such as 30 to 40 on height sets, which again would mean 30 to 40 meters above bedrock for the bottom of the crevice, it's going to randomly choose a value between those numbers for that row. So in this example, this height change rate of 20 will mean that every 20 meters, that height can change to some value between the values you have set here. So every 20 meters, it will choose another random value between these numbers. That can let your elevations change as you're going down the crevice, so it's not always at the same elevation. If you don't want it to change, you can set these to the same value. You can also set them to a smaller range, such as 30 to 32, if you want a smaller change of depths as you go along the crevice. This gives you some variety in your crevice, so it doesn't look like the same thing the entire length of the crevice. By increasing or decreasing the value, you determine how quickly or how often you want that elevation to change. Note that if you set it low and you set the range to a large range, you can end up a very spiky looking terrain on that crevice, so you may not want to do that. It's usually better to keep this a little bit higher and keep the range a little bit lower. POI list lets you place certain POI within the crevice. These are normally going to be 1 by 1 POIs, things like trees or embers. This lets you have some items within the crevice randomly placed so that it isn't quite as barren. The embers and dead trees are POIs that come with Teragon. You can also use your own POI. Again, you'd want to keep them very small, usually 1 by 1, though you could do a little bit bigger if you needed to, and then these will get placed within the crevice. The problem with anything bigger than 1 by 1 is that each row is a single block, which means it can create problems if it's anything bigger than that. Our next item here is POI density, and this is going to determine how often those items in the POI list are placed. This is a percentage, so it's between 0 and 1, which would be between 0 and 100%. So 0.3 in this example is 30%. Now these values don't mean that you're going to get it exactly 30% of the time. It's going to average it out to about 30%. So 30% means that roughly every 3 to 4 blocks, you'll see one of those POI list items being placed. If you want them more often, you can increase the value. If you want them less often, you can decrease the value. If you have allow road, this will allow a road to remain on the map. If you don't have that, the road will be removed from that row. Now, in most cases, that's not going to be an issue when you're looking at a crevice that's deep. But if you're looking at the edges of the crevice, like you have here, these are a couple meters on the edge of the crevice that aren't into the ground. These are the raised areas at the edge. So allow road will keep the road right up to the edge of the crevice, even though these parts are still part of the crevice, the road will still be on them up until it gets to the drop-off. Anything underground, you probably don't want to use allow road on. Anything that would be above ground by a small amount, such as right at the edge of the crevice, then you might want to have that road still there. The last option, lowering, relates to subsidence. If we scroll down here, we can see what it shows for subsidence. These are areas along the edges where the land is lowered down as if it's sinking into the crevice a little bit. So when you set that here, it will allow that to happen. If you do not want that to happen, then you would leave lowering off. Like with roads, you normally would only use this on the edges of the crevice that are at ground level, rather than areas of the crevice that are deep into the ground. Now, these are your crevice text box commands and parameters. By adjusting these, you can create very different looking crevices. As I mentioned, you can make an inverted crevice where it looks more like a mountain. You can also make a crevice that is a lot less change in depth for each row so that you could actually make a river with it with smoother sides. It all depends on the number of lines you use and the difference in elevations between each of those lines, and whether those lines take you above or below the surface of the ground. Using these text box commands in combination with all of the other parameters for Create Crevices, you can create very unique and interesting crevices that vary from map to map depending on your values. Again, the rest of these parameters are described in this help text on the side. So if you want to get help on what any of these things mean or how you can change them, just look over here and you'll be able to find out what those things do. There may be another video that goes over these extra parameters at a later time, but I wanted to cover these text box commands because they're the most confusing to understand when you're learning how to create crevices. If you have any questions about creating crevices or anything else about using Teragon, please check out the chat and help channel on Teragon's Discord, and someone will be able to help you.